G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the study of the last days. Thank you for coming along. Thanks for coming along. In session 6, just in the last session, we were looking at there are a couple of passages we're looking at to do with the regathering of Israel in unbelief for a period of judgment. And we're going to continue and finish off that tonight, and we're going to continue into some further parts. Now, we saw that Ezekiel was speaking of a regathering in unbelief for a future time of wrath. And this takes place, why? So that they can be purified. And then as a purified believing nation, Israel will then turn to the Lord. So the purpose of a worldwide regathering in unbelief is for a specific future judgment to bring Israel to national repentance. And another prophet which addresses a worldwide regathering is Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 11, verses 11 to 12. But notice in verse 11, if you have your Bible, in verse 11, he says, "And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord will set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people." Now, this is the second time. And this is the second time that the regathering is from the four corners of the earth. But this one in Isaiah is a regathering in faith. So that means that there were only two worldwide regatherings. The first one is in unbelief, and this one in Isaiah 11 is the second one in faith. Now, remember, we were looking at some views on the reestablishment of Israel. Now, we're going to look at the fourth view on the reestablishment of Israel. This fourth view recognizes that there are two types of regathering prophecies. Those that predict a regathering in unbelief, and those that speak of a regathering in faith. So far, so good. But then the fourth view goes on to make the following claim: we really cannot be sure that the modern state of Israel is a fulfillment of those prophecies that spoke of the regathering in unbelief. Question is, why not? Well, because those who hold this view will say that it is possible to have several regatherings in unbelief before there is the one specific one that fulfills the prophecy that Ezekiel and Isaiah just spoke about. Well, we've just seen Isaiah 11 to 12, that there cannot be several regatherings in unbelief from the four corners of the earth. From Isaiah 11 down to Isaiah 12, verse 6, the context of the passage is the final worldwide regathering in faith for the blessing of the Messianic kingdom. And then Isaiah numbered this final worldwide regathering as the second one, as the second worldwide regathering. In other words, the final regathering is only the second regathering. So if that's the final regathering, which is the second one, how many can there be before that one? Only one. Only one worldwide regathering before the second one. The Bible does not allow for several worldwide regatherings in unbelief. It only allows for one worldwide regathering in unbelief. And then that's followed by the final regathering, the second one, in faith. Or as I said, it's a second time that the Lord will set his hand to recover the remnant of his people. Therefore, if that's the case, it means that the present Jewish state is very relevant to Bible prophecy. So we've established that there is a regathering in unbelief for judgment and a second worldwide regathering in faith for blessing. What we've not seen so far is when will the regathering in unbelief for judgment occur? Now, other passages give us a time frame, and one of them is Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 1 to 2. Now, Zephaniah in chapter 1, verses 7 to 18, he describes some features of a time called the day of Jehovah, or your translation might have the day of the Lord. This is the most common Old Testament name for the tribulation. And then in Zephaniah 2, 1-2, Zephaniah spoke of an event that is to occur before the day of Jehovah begins. In verse 1 of Zephaniah 2, Israel is told to gather together. And this verse tells us that it is a regathering in unbelief. Why? Because it says it's a nation that has not yet ashamed of her sins. So in verse 2, the word before is used 3 times in relation to the preceding passage regarding the tribulation. So one of these befores includes before the day of Jehovah itself. So while other texts speak of a regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment, Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 1-2 clearly tell us that this regathering in unbelief for judgment will happen before the tribulation or the day of the Lord begins. Now, the Jewish state is presupposed, and we're going to look at this a little bit later on. But we know from Scripture that a Jewish state must be functioning before the beginning of the tribulation. Why? Because there must be a state of Israel to sign the 7-year covenant made between the Antichrist and the leaders of Israel. Now, this signing is what begins the tribulation. It is not the rapture, as many believe. It is a signing of the 7-year covenant between the Antichrist and the leaders of Israel. Therefore, the signing of such a covenant presupposes a Jewish leadership of a Jewish state. Has to be in existence. So this Jewish state must exist before the covenant is signed. And this demands the existence of a Jewish state before the tribulation. When did this happen? Well, it happened in 1948 with the birth of the nation of Israel. That's when the state began. That's when the state was. That's when Israel became a nation again, became a state again. So, 1948 now marks another birth pang of the last days. The restoration of the Jewish state is a fulfillment of those prophecies that spoke of a regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment. Remember, first birth pang was at World War I, World War II. That's the first birth pang. That began the last days. The countdown started from then. So here is another event leading up to the tribulation. And now this sets the stage for several more to come along. And we're going to see this in the sequence of pre-tribulation events. We're going to look at Jerusalem under Jewish control. This is another one of those events. The fact that Israel had to come into existence before the tribulation does not necessarily require the Jewish control of the city of Jerusalem. After the end of the Israeli War of Independence in 1948-49, Israeli forces were in control of West Jerusalem, the newer Jewish section. The old city of Jerusalem, the biblical city, fell into the hands of the Jordanian Legion and was later annexed into the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. Jerusalem remained a divided city for the next 19 years. However, prophetically speaking, the old city of Jerusalem had to fall under Jewish control. And this can be concluded from the prophecies dealing with the third Jewish temple, which we call the Tribulation Temple. Remember, there are 4 temples. The third temple is a Tribulation Temple. Four passages of scripture that speak of a specific event in relationship to this temple. So this event that we're going to see here will occur in the middle of the tribulation. Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, which is the signing of the covenant. It says, he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. That's with Israel. And in the middle of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. So sacrificial system will cease. It means that the temple has to be functioning for this to happen. And this is in the middle of the tribulation, this happens. Matthew 24, verse 15, it says that you will see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Must be a temple. 2 Thess 2, verse 3-4, it speaks of the man of sin or the man of perdition sitting in the temple of God, declaring himself to be God. Needs a temple. Needs a temple for this to happen. Revelation 11, verses 1-2. And there was given to me a reed like unto a rod, And one said, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and them that worship therein. So again, Revelation 11, 1-2, it means the temple is now functioning. So that's in the tribulation period. So all of these passages speak of the tribulation temple, and they view the Jewish temple as having been built and is now functioning. So for that to happen, this presupposes Jewish control of the temple compound, which in turn presupposes Jewish control of the old city of Jerusalem. Now, none of these passages here spell out a time factor as to when the building of the temple was to occur. They state there's something that was clearly fulfilled in the Six-Day War, because in the Six-Day War, the Six-Day War was never predicted in the scriptures, right? But what it accomplished was predicted in the scriptures. It brought about the fulfillment of the prophecy regarding the Jewish control of the old city of Jerusalem. This is the third major tribulation event and the third birth pang, which is Jerusalem under Jewish control, all of Jerusalem under Jewish control. Then we have those three birth pangs. They're history. They're in the past. And the next six are all future events. And one of them, the next one we're going to look at, is the Northern Alliance invasion of Israel, found in Ezekiel 38 and 39. Ezekiel 38, 1-39, 16 describes an invasion of Israel from the north and the subsequent destruction of those invading forces once they reach the area of the mountains of Israel. Now we're going to go through this passage and just look at the areas, and then we'll see what takes place. Now, we see the alliance in 38 verses 1-6, and concerning who is involved, the prophet named the peoples in this invasion in Ezekiel 38, 1-6. In verses 1-2, attention is centered on Gog. Now, Gog, he is the leader of the land of Magog. He's the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Now, who Gog will be can only be determined at the time of the invasion. Why? Because Gog is not a person's name. It's a title for the ruler of Magog, like how you'd have Caesar or Czar or Pharaoh. It's just a title. Whoever is ruling the alliance at the time of the invasion will be Ezekiel's Gog. You know, Magog, Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal are tribes of the ancient world which occupied the areas of modern-day Russia. Magog, Meshech, and Tubal were between the Black and Caspian Seas, which today is southern Russia. It also includes parts of Iran and Turkey. Rosh was in what is now northern Russia. In fact, the term Rosh is the basis for the modern name Russia. Now, these names then cover the modern territories of northern and southern Russia in Europe and Siberia to the east in Asia. So the modern nation of Russia encompasses all these areas of Ezekiel. Now, verse 6 adds that these come from the uttermost parts of the north. Now, from where you are in Israel, the uttermost parts of the north is Russia, with Moscow being almost a straight line due north from Jerusalem. So Russia is the leader of this northern confederacy, with Gog as the leader of Russia. As we say, we don't know who Gog is at this point in time, but when the invasion takes place, we'll know what his name is. Russia has allies. She's part of a confederacy of nations and the leader of it. Now, verses 5-6 list them for us, starting with Persia or present-day Iran. There was actually a time when Iran was generally pro-West, pro-Israel, but that changed after the revolution in 1979. Iran then became anti-Western and anti-Israel and sided more with Russia. Today, Israel considers Iran its most dangerous enemy. Cush is the next nation involved. Now, there are two places that had that name. One was in Mesopotamia, which we find in Genesis 2:13, but all the other usages of this word Cush refers to Ethiopia. Put is the next, which is Somalia. Somalia borders Ethiopia. Just by the by, sometimes people say that Put is actually Libya, but no, the word for Libya is Lub, L-U-B, not Put. Put is Somalia. Then we have Gomer. Gomer is called Germania in the Midrash, Rabbah 37:1. The Talmud also refers to Gomer as Germany. Now, according to the rabbis, Gomer is located in present-day Germany. Togarmah is present-day Armenia. And then verse 6 adds the phrase, even many more peoples with you. Well, that might simply just define that the number of the nations, which are already mentioned here. Another important thing here is that while the names of the geographical areas have changed over the centuries, like Persia to Iran, and they could change again for all we know, it's all about the geography. It's where these areas were in Ezekiel's day, and those areas are still there today. So regardless of what names they may carry at the time of the Ezekiel invasion, it is these geographical areas that will be involved. Now, the cup of iniquity of Russia is almost full. And with this invasion, it will overflow. And this will precipitate God's judgment on the nation. Remember, God is in control here. He's the one who's bringing the invasion about. And it will be the means by which God will punish Russia for her sins. And the key sin of Russia is her long history of anti-Semitism. And it's a problem that persists in Russia even to today. Now we have 6 Japhetite nations: Gomer, Magog, Tubal, Meshech, Togarmah, and Persia. 2 Hamite nations, Ethiopia and Somalia. There's no Semite nations here, and not a single Arab state is part of this invasion. Japheth and Ham and Shem were the sons of Noah. And these are the tribes that came out of that. Now we find the object of the invasion in verses 7 to 9. And again, this passage addresses Gog as the leader of this confederacy. And it then states that the specific place of the invasion would be the land of Israel, more specifically in the mountains of Israel. Verse 8 describes this Jewish state as being 4 things. It is a land brought back from the sword. It is a land that is gathered out of many peoples, a land with mountains that have been a continual waste. It's a land that is brought forth out of the peoples. Now, Ezekiel is not describing an Israel that ever existed in ancient times, but all these statements are true of present-day Israel today. The waste places of verse 12 of Israel have been rebuilt and resettled on a more massive scale. Verse 9 describes the massiveness of the invasion. It pictures it as a storm cloud that covers the entire land. It's just a mass of soldiers coming down. Again, Israel has to be a state before this invasion can occur, so it requires the pre-existence of the Jewish state. And this passage also shows Israel as a nation regathered in unbelief, for only after the invasion, only after the Russian allied invasion, do many Jewish people then turn to the Lord. So they're still in unbelief. Now, Gog's goal we find in verses 10 to 13. It answers the question as to why this invasion will take place in the part of Russia. And what's it all about? It's all about spoil. Now we see Gog's planning in verse 10 that things, verse 10 says that things shall come into your mind and you shall devise an evil device. So it's a premeditated attack. The plan in verse 11, Russia and his allies, the Confederacy, decides to go to them that are at rest, that dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls. So they're dwelling securely. And what's the purpose of it? Verse 12 tells us. It's spoil. Now, in Ezekiel's day, it mentions cattle, goods, silver, and gold. But back in Ezekiel's day, that's the spoil. That's the Old Testament references for spoils of war. In verse 13, a second group of nations are protesting this invasion because they recognize it to be an invasion for spoil and for nothing else. And these are Sheba, Dedan, and Tarshish. The first two are countries in northern Arabia, which shows that at least some of the Arab states will not favor the Russian invasion and presence in the Middle East. The name Tarshish is followed by the phrase, with all the young lions thereof. Well, this phrase is a Hebrew idiom meaning nations that come out of Tarshish. Now, based on the way that Ezekiel uses Tarshish and also where it's used in other parts of the scriptures, the identification for Tarshish would have to be Spain and the Spanish-speaking world of the Western Hemisphere. So this is just a protest, nothing more. They just simply protest. They don't do anything else. So Russia invades with no interference from them. Almost what we're seeing today. God's goal in Ezekiel 38, 14 to 16. Now we're looking at it from God's viewpoint as to why this invasion takes place. In that day when my people Israel dwell securely, shall you not know it? Come out of the, verse 15 says it, they'll come out of the uttermost parts of the north, which we know from where Israel is seated, that the north is from where Russia comes. So in verses 14 to 16, we have the invasion. It begins and the Confederate army covers the land like a storm cloud. It's just massive numbers. So they're in the land. So there's initial success on the part of Russia. They're in the land without any resistance. But then in the second part of verse 16, God's reason is given for allowing this invasion to occur. Over against what Russia's reasons were in the preceding verses. God says that God, might be sanctified in the eyes of the nations in light of what is about to occur. And then we see the destruction of the invaders in verses 17 to 23 of Ezekiel 38. With the Russian invasion of Israel, the cup of iniquity is full. The apple of God's eye is touched, and the wife of Jehovah is now violated, arousing God's anger so that he moves out in judgment to destroy the invading army. In verses 19 to 22, the invading army is disposed of and destroyed. Several means are listed. We have earthquakes. We have civil war breaking out among the invading soldiers themselves. That's the Allied Confederacy. We have pestilence, blood, flood, hailstones, fire, brimstone, everything thrown at them. Now, since these things annihilate the invading army without the aid of other nations, God's purpose is seen as succeeding in its objective. Why? Because God is indeed sanctified in the eyes of many people, many nations. The place of the destruction we find in chapter 39, verses 1 to 6. So we have here a description of the invasion and the destruction. We have some new information here in 39, which we didn't have in 38. We find this in verses 2 and 4, where the armies are said to fall specifically on the mountains of Israel. Now, these mountains extend the length of the center of the country, beginning at the southern point of the valley of Jezreel, at the town of Jenin in Galilee, and continuing south at a point north of Beersheba in the Negev. So these mountains contain the famous biblical cities of Dothan and Shechem, Samaria, Shiloh, Bethel, Ai, Ramah, Bethlehem, Hebron, Debir, and most importantly, Jerusalem. Now, the Six-Day War has set the stage for the fulfillment of this prophecy. Because up to the Six-Day War in 1967, all the mountains of Israel, except for a very small corridor in West Jerusalem, were entirely in the hands of the Jordanian Arabs. Only since 1967 have the mountains of Israel been in Israel, setting the stage for the fulfillment of this prophecy. So, up until 1967, this invasion couldn't have occurred. In Ezekiel 39:6, the land of Russia is also devastated. God says, I'll send a fire in Magog. So we have destruction of the army plus the nation. And then Russia ceases to be a nation. She ceases to be a political force in world affairs. We have in verses 7 and 8 of 39 the sanctification of God's name. So not only will God's name be sanctified in Israel, where he says, and my holy name will I make known in the midst of my people Israel, but also among the Gentile nations. We see in the second part of verse 7, the nations shall know that I am Jehovah, the Holy One in Israel. So what we see out of this is that there's a revival that occurs in Israel, causing many Jews to turn back to the Lord. Now, we have 7 years of burning in verses 9 to 10 of Ezekiel 39. It states here that it's going to take 7 years to dismantle all the military equipment which is left behind by this Confederate armies. And they're going to be used for fuel. In verse 9, it says, and shall make fires of the weapons and burn them. They shall make fires of them 7 years. So it's 7 years of burning of these weapons. Now we have the 7 months of burial, according to Ezekiel 39, 11 to 16. Verse 11 tells us the burial place will be in one of the valleys east of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this would put this place in the Jordan Valley above the Dead Sea. The valley is going to be renamed also after this. In verses 11 to 12, it states here that it will take 7 months to accomplish the job of burying. Why is it going to take so long? Well, because the armies will be destroyed in the mountains of Israel, so many of the bodies will be in crevices where they'll not be easily found, and therefore, according to verses 14 to 15, special details will be employed by the government to search out for these bodies for burial in the valley. Now, overlooking the cemetery in the burial place, a new city will be built and named Hamona, which means multitude. Now, these 7 months of burying and the 7 years of burning described in verses 9 to 10 of the previous section are crucial in determining when this invasion will occur. So for any view in this invasion of when it takes place, it needs to satisfy the requirements of the 7 months of burial and the 7 years of burning. Now, some basic observations here regarding the timing of the invasion. The most controversial question in Ezekiel 38-39 is when. When in the chronology of prophecy will the Russian invasion occur? It's obvious from where the event is placed in this work that the author, which is Dr. Fruchtenbaum, views the events as taking place sometime before the tribulation. Now, what's the basic observations we see here? Well, we can see some clues here in Ezekiel 38, verse 8, and verses 11 to 12 and 14. These verses state that the event will take place when 4 things may be said of Israel. First up, Israel is a state again. Verse 8, the waste places of past centuries are again inhabited. Israel is dwelling in unwalled villages, which is a very good description of present-day kibbutzim. Israel is dwelling securely, which means Israel is living in security, which means she's living in confidence of her abilities to defend herself, regardless of whether it is during a state of war or peace. Everything in these verses is absolutely true of Israel today. So as far as where Israel stands today, she completely fulfills all the requirements for the invasion to take place. So from this standpoint, the invasion can occur at any time, including sometime before the tribulation. Now, when discussing the timing of the invasion, the 7 years and the 7 months must be considered. Now, there are 5 major views. 5 major, that's right, there's 5 there. The opposing views will be looked at first along with their bases, followed by the objections against these positions. And then we're going to look at the reasons we're given as to why this invasion would best be viewed as occurring before the tribulation period. And then we'll look at the objections to that view. We have the mid-tribulation view, we have the post-tribulation view, the interlude view, end of millennium view, and then we have the pre-tribulation view. So we're looking at the mid-tribulation view. This is the first view held by some key teachers of Bible prophecy, and they put the Russian invasion in the middle of the tribulation period. And there's a twofold basis for this position. First, the dwelling securely is said to refer to a time of peace resulting from Israel's covenant with the Antichrist described in chapter 9, verse 27 of Daniel. Remember, the Antichrist gives them a guarantee of peace for 7 years. Second, but he breaks at midpoint. Second, this invasion is viewed as being the same as that of the king of the north found in Daniel chapter 11, verse 40. So this is the views of the mid-tribulation. Now, let's look at the objections to this. First up, the term dwell securely does not necessarily have to indicate peace. Second, it's hard to see why God would intervene at this point in Israel's behalf and then immediately allow the events of the second half of the tribulation to commence, doing a great deal of damage to Israel. Third, it is agreed with those holding this position that the events described in Daniel 11, verse 40, will take place in the middle of the tribulation. But it is wrong to identify Daniel as king of the north with Gog of Ezekiel 38:1 to 39:16, because throughout the book of Daniel, references are made to the king of the south and the king of the north. And consistently, the king of the south is applied to Egypt, including a reference in verse 40, Daniel 11:40. The king of the north is consistently applied to Syria. However, for some reason, when those who have this view come to the verse 40, they ascribe the reference to Russia. So it goes from Syria to Russia. And so they identify Russia with Daniel 11:40, with Ezekiel 38 and 39. But we need to keep things in their context. We need to be consistent when we interpret scriptures. The reference always refers to Syria in Daniel. The invasion of Daniel 11:40 is distinct from the invasion of Ezekiel 38 to 39. It is inconsistent exegesis to make the king of the north refer to Syria throughout the book of Daniel, and yet make Daniel 11:40 be the one exception in the book to connect it with the Russian invasion of Ezekiel 38, 39. And then, put that in the middle of the tribulation. The fourth objection here is that this view fails to solve the problem of the 7 months and 7 years. It would require that the 7 months of burying take place during the second half of the tribulation. And what's happening then? The Jews are fleeing out of Israel into hiding, and they won't be able even to bury their own dead, much less the dead from this allied army. Regarding the 7 years of burning, again, this view would require the Jews to be burning weapons during the second half of the tribulation when they're actually fleeing from the land. In fact, they'd have to continue burning them for 3.5 years into the millennium kingdom, into the Messianic kingdom, which would be inconsistent with the Messiah's cleansing of the land and the renovation which results. And the problem the Jews will face during the second half of the tribulation would cause them to try to preserve and salvage the weapons so they can defend themselves rather than burning them. There's a brief graphic there for you. As you can see, in the midpoint of the tribulation, the burying, yes, that's possible. However, the Jews are fleeing, so it's not going to happen. And then the 7 years of burning go into the 3.5 years into the Messianic kingdom. That's not going to happen. Then we have the post-tribulation or the Armageddon view. And that view says that the Russian invasion will take place at the end of the tribulation period. And the key basis of this position is identifying the invasion as a campaign of Armageddon. This campaign will indeed occur at the end of the tribulation. However, Those who hold this view believe that Ezekiel 38:39 is part of this campaign. And because they believe that, they've now concluded that the Russian invasion will occur at the end of the tribulation. But hello, Ezekiel 38:39 is not part of this campaign. And I'll show you why. Several problems with this view, and the key objection lies in the clear distinction between Ezekiel 38:39 invasion and the campaign of Armageddon. First up, look at Ezekiel. Ezekiel mentioned that definite allies who are limited in number, while other nations stand in opposition. Now, in the campaign of Armageddon, all nations are allied together against Jerusalem without exception. Second, the Ezekiel invasion comes from the north, but the Armageddon invasion comes from the whole earth. Third, the purpose of the Russian invasion is to take the spoil. The purpose of the Armageddon campaign is to destroy all the Jews. Fourth, in the Ezekiel invasion, there's a protest against the invasion. But in the Armageddon campaign, there's no protest because all the nations are involved. And fifth, the armies of the Ezekiel invasion are destroyed through convulsions of nature. The army of the Armageddon invasion is destroyed by the second coming of Jesus the Messiah. And sixth, the armies of the Ezekiel invasion are destroyed on the mountains of Israel. The Armageddon's invasion army is destroyed in the area between Petra and Jerusalem. Seventh, the Russian invasion takes place while Israel is living securely in the land. Armageddon campaign takes place while Israel is in flight and is in hiding. So Ezekiel 38 and 39 cannot be the Armageddon campaign. Nothing about it fits. Furthermore, this view also fails to solve the problem of the 7 months and 7 years, since both would have to continue into the millennium to be accomplished. Again, this is inconsistent with other revelations regarding the Messianic kingdom, which starts out with a thoroughly cleansed earth. Then we have the interlude view. This is the third major view. And this puts the invasion in the interlude between the tribulation and the millennium. And the basis for this position is the assumption that there's going to be a period of time after the second coming and after Israel is restored, but before the actual kingdom is set up. Now, objections. There are two objections to this view. First of all, this position is based on the assumption that there will be a period of time between the second coming and the establishment of the millennial kingdom. That's true. There will be. We can verify that from the scriptures. And a number of things will be accomplished in that interlude. You know, we're going to have the judgments of the Gentiles, the resurrection of the Old Testament saints, the tribulation saints. However, the problem here is that if this view is to be consistent, it must make this interlude 7 years long. But Daniel chapter 12, verse 12 limits it to just 75 days. The second half of the tribulation is declared to be 42 months or 1,260 days, 3.5 years. Now, Daniel 12, verse 7 refers to it as a times and a half, 3.5 years. Daniel 12:11 states that there'll be a total of 1,290 days, during which time the temple will be desecrated. In other words, the temple's desecration will extend 30 days beyond the 3.5 year period. Now, in Daniel 12:12, he says those who make it to the 1,335th day, which is an additional 45 days, are promised a unique blessing which would hardly be anything else other than the Messianic kingdom. So the fact that Daniel limits this interlude to 75 days means that there won't be enough time for all the events of Ezekiel to transpire. It's just not going to happen. A second objection to this view is that it fails to give a good answer to the problem of the 7 months and 7 years. 7 months of burial is 210 days. This would mean that the burial would continue for at least 135 days into the millennium kingdom, depending on when during the interlude the invasion takes place. Not consistent with this massive scripture describing the millennium or Messianic kingdom and Israel. What about the 7 years of burning? This view it's an impossible view. So we see here that the burial, in this view, burial would continue 135 days into the Messianic kingdom, the renovated, restored earth. Not going to happen. Not the interlude view. That one won't work. End of millennium view. Well, it's another major view. This puts the Russian invasion at the end of the millennium. And the key basis for this position is to equate the invasion with the one mentioned in Revelation 20, verse 7 to 9. Two basic objections to this. First of all, the Ezekiel invasion comes from the north. The Revelation invasion will come from all over the world. Second, this view also fails to answer the problem of the 7 months and the 7 years. This earth is done away with soon after the invasion mentioned in Revelation 20, not allowing any time or place for 7 months of burial, much less 7 years of burning. It would require the burying and the burning to continue into the eternal order. It's not going to happen. There it is there, quick schematic for you. Now, the pre-tribulation view. This is the view which the author of The Footsteps of the Messiah, Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, this is his view. And his view is that the Russian invasion will occur before the tribulation begins. From the text of Ezekiel 38, 1 to 39, 16, this view arrives at the following conclusions. First up, Israel is established before the tribulation and is dwelling in safety. Second, the Russian Confederacy invades Israel during this time of security before the tribulation. Third, the Confederacy is destroyed in Israel before the tribulation. What's the support for this? At least three arguments. First, the description of Israel found in Ezekiel 38 to 39 fits very well the nation and she is today. And here she is, she's established before the tribulation. It's a land brought back from the sword in verse 38:8. After 1900 years, 46 invasions and the War of Independence, the land is Jewish again and free from foreign domination. This nation is gathered from many nations and peoples. The continual waste places are now inhabited, verses 8 to 12. Israelis today are rebuilding the ancient places and turning them into modern towns and cities. They dwell securely. Now, this does not mean a state of peace. The Hebrew word from which the root comes from here is the word batak. Batak means security. This is not security due to a state of peace, but a security due to confidence in their own strength and abilities to defend themselves. It's a good description of Israel today. The Israeli army has fought 4 major wars since its founding and won them very quickly. Today, Israel is secure, confident that her army can repel any invasion from the Arab states. So Israel is currently dwelling securely. Ezekiel 38:11 adds that she's living safely in unwalled villages. Again, this is a very good description of the kibbutzim in Israel. Second, to this day, Russia is still a major world power. Her rise to this position before the tribulation coincided with the re-establishment of Israel following World War II. Third, this view best answers the problem of the 7 months and 7 years. Because if we're to put this invasion in the beginning of the tribulation, that presents no problem with the 7 months of burying the dead. But it does have problems with the 7 years, as it would put the burning of the weapons at a time when Israel would be in flight and would not have time to finish the job. Therefore, the before the tribulation view is the only one which has no problems with either the 7 months or the 7 years. The Jews continue to dwell in the land after this invasion and remain there until the middle of the tribulation. So the 7 months of burial is no problem. The 7 years also create no problem since they would begin before the tribulation and can extend as far as the middle of the tribulation. So they can begin at least 3.5 years before the tribulation starts, and they would be finished by the midpoint of the tribulation. So according to this view, the Russian invasion must take place at least that 3.5 years before the tribulation starts. So these are the strengths of this view. So what we see here is the invasion could happen where the burning finishes before the tribulation, or at the latest, the middle of the tribulation. Now we have some objections here. The first objection states that Ezekiel 38 to 39 is part of the restoration section of Ezekiel, the restoration section in the book of Ezekiel. Well, that is true. It is in that area, but which restoration? Ezekiel is describing in this passage the partial restoration in unbelief. Is it the partial in unbelief, or the final in faith? What he's describing, he's speaking about the partial restoration in unbelief. Ezekiel 38, 39 is speaking about the partial restoration in unbelief into the land. Faith begins in Israel only after the Russian invasion. Remember, God is sanctified in the nation of Israel. The restoration in faith is covered in chapters 40 to 48 of Ezekiel. That's the second restoration. The other objection most commonly used is that dwelling safely or securely, as is used in the Old Testament, always refers to millennial peace and security. Something that Israel will not receive before the tribulation. Well, as we just said before, while the term dwell securely is indeed used of life in the millennium, this is true only of the minority of verses and not true of all the majority. Jeremiah 49 verse 31 is a good reference in particular because it uses the very same Hebrew phrases that are found here in Ezekiel 38:11. And the phrase to dwell securely is used more often in non-millennial contexts than in millennial ones. Third objection states that before the tribulation view, a third objection states that the before the tribulation view contradicts the doctrine of imminency. Now, imminency, what are we talking about? Stating that something must precede the tribulation is not the same as stating that it must precede the rapture, unless it is further stated that the rapture begins the tribulation. Because remember, many believe that it is the rapture that begins the tribulation, but it's not. It's the signing of the 7-year covenant that begins the tribulation. The before the tribulation view asserts, right, that the Russian invasion will occur before the signing of the 7-year covenant. So this does not contradict the doctrine of imminency, because the rapture, which is imminent, may still come even before the invasion. It can come today. The rapture continues to be both imminent and pre-trib. It can occur at any time between now and the signing of the 7-year covenant. Now, it does not mean that the rapture begins the tribulation. So to say that the Russian invasion will take place before the tribulation does not negate imminency of the rapture, since it is not the rapture that begins the tribulation. Rapture can happen now. Could the rapture have come before 1948? Yes, it could have, because the rapture is imminent. Could the tribulation have come before 1948? No, it couldn't have. Why? Because there was no Jewish state and government to sign the covenant with the Antichrist. Fourth objection, it states, how could Israel apostatize so soon after the nation experienced a revival? Well, why should this be a problem? Because have a look in Old Testament history. Have a look in the book of Judges, for instance. Israel often apostatized very quickly after revival. There was speedy apostasy of Israel following the various miracles of the Exodus and the recognition of God at Sinai. There was a speedy apostasy after the revivals of Hezekiah and Josiah. So there's no problem with it happening again. A fifth objection states that the Russian invasion will happen in the latter days and years. Ezekiel 38:8 tells us this. Now, the expression here simply applies to the whole period of the end times when prophecy is again being fulfilled. And so it can very easily apply to the closing days of the church age as well. So this is a position of a pre-tribulational invasion, but not a pre-rapture invasion. A sixth and final objection states that Israel will not gain any title to the land nor have the right to return until she signs a covenant with the Antichrist. Well, guess what? Israel has possessed the title of the land since God made his covenants with Abraham. Also, the United Nations recognized Israel in 1948, and Jews have had the right to return and have been returning ever since then. So in what way could the covenant with the Antichrist give the Jews the right to return to the land that the United Nations did not? Israel's right to return will not be based on a covenant with the Antichrist any more than it is based on the full recognition by the United Nations. God gave them the land. It's their land. The scriptures predict a regathering before the tribulation in unbelief in preparation for judgment. It is God who is doing the moving, and it is God who is bringing the Jews back into the land. And this is enough for Israel's right to the land. A covenant with the Antichrist will hardly give Israel any additional right to return. Israel is back in the land before the tribulation, and hence the Russian invasion could easily take place before the tribulation. So if we were to combine the scriptural facts and the answers to objections raised to the pre-tribulation view, this Dr. Fruchtenbaum concludes that this position is by far the best to take. And if we look at it logically, it is by far the best to take. The Russian invasion is another birth pang that will occur before the tribulation begins. Thank you for coming along tonight, and I pray that this will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Study hard and grow strong.